I am Olivia, 33 years old, and sitting at my family's opulent Christmas dinner. I watched my brother toss a pity envelope of cash at my plate. He laughed, telling me to use it to keep my failing little software hobby afloat. My parents joined in the mockery, sighing about how embarrassing I was to their country club friends. I just smiled and took a sip of my wine, knowing that a Forbes article announcing the $170 million all-cash sale of my company was going live in exactly 2 minutes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut meant absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling stone mansion, emotional warmth was non-existent. My parents, Richard and Patricia Bennett, valued status above all else. They curated our image with ruthless precision. Tonight was no different. The dining room table was a masterpiece of holiday excess. Crystal glasses gleamed under the custom chandelier, and the scent of expensive catered food filled the air. I sat quietly wearing a simple black dress, feeling the chill of isolation. Across from me sat my older brother Spencer, the undisputed golden child. At 35, Spencer played the role of a successful real estate investor, a title funded entirely by our parents' bank accounts. Beside him sat his wife Naomi, a brilliant African-American corporate lawyer who always seemed slightly out of place in this den of toxic entitlement. The evening had been a relentless chorus of Spencer boasting. "Well," he announced loudly, "I just closed a massive commercial deal downtown. $10 million. It was a tough negotiation, but that is what separates the real businessmen from the amateurs." My father, Richard, beamed with pride, raising his expensive crystal glass. "That is my boy. Real estate is where the true legacy is built. You have the Bennett instinct for it, Spencer." Suddenly, something heavy landed on my plate with a loud thud. I looked down. It was a thick, pristine white envelope. Spencer grinned at me, his teeth gleaming in the candlelight. "Open it, little sister," he urged, his tone dripping with condescension. I carefully peeled back the paper flap. Inside sat a stack of crisp $100 bills. $5,000 in total. Consider it a holiday bonus. Spencer laughed. "A little pocket change. I know things must be incredibly tight with that little software hobby of yours. You can use it to pay your rent this month, or maybe buy yourself some decent clothes. You cannot keep showing up to family events looking like you just crawled out of a cubicle." My hands remained perfectly steady. The sheer audacity of his gesture was breathtaking. He was throwing cash at me like a charity case to inflate his own ego. My mother, Patricia, sighed deeply, adjusting her diamond necklace. "You really should thank your brother Olivia," she said, her voice laced with familiar, icy disappointment. "He is being incredibly generous. We worry about you constantly." A 33-year-old single woman still playing entrepreneur in a rented apartment. "It is frankly exhausting to explain you to our friends at the country club." I placed the envelope on the table. "What exactly are you explaining to them, Mom?" I asked calmly. Richard scoffed, dropping his napkin. "We tell them you are finding yourself. Because what else can we say? That our daughter is wasting her life typing code in the dark while her brother is building an empire. You have no husband, no real assets, and no stable career. It is an embarrassment, Olivia. Women your age should be established or working a respectable job at a real company like Spencer's." The action-based backstory of my life flashed through my mind. When Spencer wanted to start his business, they handed him $2 million in seed money. When I got accepted to college, they refused to waste money on a degree they deemed useless. I took out predatory student loans. I worked double shifts as a waitress. I coded my supply chain management platform from a damp basement while eating instant noodles. I built my software for independent pharmacies, an industry they mocked as boring and blue-collar. I bled for my independence while Spencer played with their money. Spencer leaned across the table. "You should really take Dad up on his offer, Liv. I could use a new administrative assistant. You could answer my phones, organize my schedule. It would be a real paycheck. You could finally shut down that worthless little business and join the real world. Naomi shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Spencer, she murmured softly. That is enough. She runs her own company. You do not need to be insulting. Let her hear it, Naomi. Patricia snapped, glaring at her daughter-in-law. Someone needs to give this girl a reality check. We are tired of pretending her little computer project is a real career. She needs to wake up. I sat in the center of their hostility. For 33 years, I had swallowed their insults. I had absorbed their sneers. I had allowed them to treat me as the family failure, the scapegoat, the cautionary tale they used to make themselves feel superior. I looked at the envelope of cash sitting next to my wine glass. A bribe to keep me small, a prop for Spencer's fragile masculinity. My phone vibrated silently against the mahogany table. It was the notification I had been waiting for all day. I did not cry. I did not yell. Instead, I let the heavy, oppressive silence stretch out. I let their smug, self-satisfied smiles settle on their faces. I took a deliberate sip of my red wine, feeling the power shift, before they even realized what was happening to them. I reached across the pristine white tablecloth, my fingertips resting lightly against the thick paper envelope. I did not shove it. I did. I did not throw it in anger. I calmly and deliberately slid it back across the polished mahogany until it hit the base of Spencer's wine glass. I do not need cash from your maxed-out credit cards, Spencer, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The slight widening of his eyes told me my comment about his credit limits had struck a nerve, but his arrogant smirk quickly returned. You should really learn how to accept a gift, Liv, he sneered, picking up his glass. Pride does not pay the rent. I am not worried about my rent, I replied, folding my hands in my lap. Because I sold my company this morning. For a fraction of a second, the room was completely silent. Then Spencer threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. My father, Richard, chuckled along with him, shaking his head as he sliced into his prime rib. Even my mother, Patricia, offered a thin, condescending smile, the kind she usually reserved for the waitstaff at the country club. Well, congratulations, Spencer gasped, wiping a fake tear from his eye. Who finally bought out your little supply chain project? Did you manage to get enough to buy a used Honda? Or maybe a down payment on a modest condo in the suburbs? I am sure Mom and Dad will still let you use the family accountant to figure out the taxes on your little windfall. He was enjoying this immensely, bathing in the approval of our parents. Naomi, however, did not laugh. She was a corporate lawyer trained to read the room and detect shifts in leverage. Her dark eyes darted from Spencer's mocking face to my completely calm demeanor. She set her fork down softly, sensing the impending impact before anyone else did. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, opening the browser I had left prepared. I placed the phone flat on the table right next to the floral centerpiece and pushed it toward the center where my father and brother could clearly see the glowing display. Take a look, I said simply. Spencer leaned forward, squinting at the screen, a smug comment already forming on his lips. But the words never came out. His mouth hung open. The blood rushed out of his face so fast he looked physically ill. He blinked hard as if the screen was playing a trick on his eyes, and then he leaned closer, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. What is it? Richard demanded, annoyed by his son's sudden silence. Spencer, what does it say? When Spencer could not find his voice, I read it for him. The headline on Forbes went live 10 minutes ago. I stated, my voice ringing clear and steady in the dead silent room. Apex Holdings acquires independent pharmacy supply chain platform for $170 million. My mother let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Her hand flew to her diamond necklace, gripping it like a lifeline. Richard froze, his knife hovering an inch above his plate. 170 million, Patricia whispered, the number sounding foreign and impossible on her tongue. That is not all, I said, leaning forward slightly. Swipe to the right, Spencer. Spencer stared at me, his eyes wide and terrified, as if the phone was a live explosive. He reached out with a trembling finger and swiped the screen. The Forbes article slid away, revealing an email from my wealth management team at JP Morgan. It was a wire transfer confirmation. All cash, I confirmed, letting the reality of the words crash over them. No stock options, no multi-year earnout structure. $170 million in liquid capital transferred directly into my accounts at 9 o'clock this morning. The silence that followed was suffocating. The grand, opulent dining room suddenly felt incredibly small. I watched the realization dawn on each of their faces. They were doing the math. They were calculating the sheer magnitude of the number. It was not just wealth. It was absolute, world-altering power. You forced me to take out predatory student loans with 15% interest rates. When I was 18, I said, my voice cold and hard like polished steel. You refused to co-sign my apartment lease because you said a graphic design major was a guaranteed failure. You handed Spencer $2 million in seed money for his first real estate venture, which he bankrupted within 3 years. You told me I was wasting my life in a damp basement eating instant noodles while I wrote the initial code for my platform. You said the pharmacy supply chain industry was blue-collar and boring. You said I was an embarrassment to your social circle. Patricia stared at me, her chest heaving, completely devoid of her usual polished composure. But here is the absolute best part. I continued, my gaze locking onto my father. In one single morning, with one single signature, I just completely eclipsed the entire Bennett family generational wealth. Your commercial real estate portfolio, your trust funds, your country club memberships, and your imported cars combined do not even equal half of what I just deposited into my bank account today. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to assert his usual patriarchal dominance, but nothing came out. The man who had controlled every aspect of this family through financial leverage had just been rendered entirely obsolete. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as a terrifying, undeniable force. I took a slow sip of my wine. Spencer stared at his cash envelope. The Bennett family power dynamic shifted entirely in my favor. The absolute silence in the dining room lasted for exactly 10 seconds. I counted them in my head, watching the gears turn behind my mother's wide eyes. For 10 seconds, they processed the magnitude of my achievement, but they did not process the hard work, the sleepless nights, or the sheer grit it took to build a tech empire from nothing. They only processed the money. Patricia was the first to break the silence. She did not say congratulations. She did not express a single ounce of maternal pride. She did not apologize for the decades of belittlement. Instead, she let out a massive, breathless gasp, pressing her hands against her chest as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Oh, thank God!" Patricia cried out, a frantic smile stretching across her face. "Olivia, this is a miracle! You can save your brother's company from bankruptcy." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I set my wineglass down on the coaster, maintaining direct eye contact with her. "No." Patricia blinked, her frantic smile faltering. "What do you mean, no?" "Olivia, you have $170 million. Spencer only needs $15 million to cover the margin calls on his commercial properties. It is a drop in the bucket for you now. You can write a check tomorrow morning and clear this whole mess up." "I am not a bank, Mom," I said, my voice calm and devoid of any emotion. "And even if I were, I would not lend a single cent to a man who just threw a $5,000 envelope at my face while pretending to be a real estate mogul." Richard slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware. "You listen to me, young lady," he barked, his face flushing dark red. "This is about family. Your brother is in trouble. His lenders are threatening to seize his assets. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime, and it is your duty to step up and protect the Bennett name." A sudden, sharp crash interrupted my father's tirade. We all turned to look at Naomi. Her expensive red wine was pooling across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric and dripping onto the hardwood floor. The stem of her crystal glass lay shattered by her plate. She did not even look at the mess. Her dark, intelligent eyes were locked dead onto Spencer. Bankruptcy. Naomi repeated the word, sounding like a death sentence. Spencer swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. Naomi, honey. It is not what it sounds like, he stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Mom is just exaggerating. It is a minor cash flow issue. Naomi ignored him completely. She turned her piercing gaze toward my mother. Patricia, what exactly do you mean by margin calls and lenders seizing assets? Spencer told me this morning that he just closed a $10 million commercial deal. He told me the business was booming. Patricia looked like a deer caught in the headlights. She glanced frantically at Spencer, realizing her greed had just exposed her golden child's darkest secret to his wife. Well, you know how real estate is, Naomi, Patricia stammered, attempting to backtrack. It has its ups and downs. Spencer is just going through a little rough patch with some commercial leases. I leaned back in my chair, watching the masterful facade of the Bennett family crumble in real time. Naomi was a corporate lawyer. She did not deal in rough patches or little cash flow issues. She dealt in facts, liability, and risk assessment. I could see the gears turning in her sharp mind, analyzing every lie Spencer had fed her over the past year. I decided to help her along. It is funny how a $10 million deal can suddenly vanish into thin air, I remarked casually, swirling the remaining red wine in my glass, almost as if it never existed in the first place. Spencer whipped his head toward me, his eyes blazing with panic and fury. Shut your mouth, Olivia, he snarled. You do not know anything about my business. I know enough to recognize a sinking ship, Spencer, I countered effortlessly. I know that commercial interest rates have skyrocketed. I know your primary anchor tenants in those strip malls you bought vacated 6 months ago. And I know that when a commercial lender issues a margin call, it means the underlying asset is no longer worth the paper the loan is printed on. So tell me, Spencer, where exactly did that $5,000 in your little envelope come from? A high-interest credit card cash advance? Naomi turned to her husband, her voice dangerously quiet. Spencer, look at me. He hesitated, looking everywhere but at his wife. Look at me, Naomi commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Is your company facing bankruptcy? Have you been lying to me about our financial security? It is temporary. Spencer pleaded, his arrogant swagger completely destroyed. The market shifted. I just need a bridge loan to carry me through the next quarter. Olivia has the money. She can fix this. She owes us. He pointed an accusing finger at me, desperately trying to shift the focus. She owes this family for everything we gave her. I felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. The audacity was truly a spectacle to behold. They spent my entire life grinding my self-esteem into the dirt, starving me of support and mocking my ambition. Now, within 2 minutes of discovering my net worth, they had already calculated how to extract $15 million from my bank account to subsidize the very golden child who had spent the evening insulting me. I looked at Naomi. Her manicured hands were trembling slightly, not out of fear, but out of pure rage. I had just handed her a perfect weapon. Richard could not stand the sight of my quiet defiance. The patriarch of the Bennett family was losing his absolute control over the dinner table, and it terrified him. He slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany table with such force that the silverware rattled against the fine china. The sudden violence in his gesture made my mother flinch, but I did not even blink. I kept my eyes locked on his, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my fear. You will wipe that smug expression off your face right this instant, Richard bellowed, his voice echoing through the massive dining room. You sit in my house drinking my wine and you dare to talk down to your brother. You dare to disrespect this family after everything we have done to ensure your future. You think because you struck gold with some software company that you are suddenly above us. You are not. You owe this family, Olivia. You owe us your compliance and you owe your brother that $15 million. I tilted my head, genuinely curious about the mental gymnastics required to reach that conclusion. I owe you. And what exactly is the origin of this massive debt, Dad? Was it the complete lack of emotional support? Or perhaps it was the time you told me I would be better off finding a rich husband because my brain was not wired for complex business structures. Patricia sat up straighter, sensing an opportunity to regain the moral high ground. Do not play the victim, Olivia, she scolded, her tone sharp and reprimanding. We set you up for life. We gave you the Bennett name, and let us not forget the family trust fund. We graciously added your name to the primary family trust when you turned 18. We secured your financial future before you even stepped foot on a college campus. You have been resting on a safety net we built, and now it is time to pay your dues. You will transfer the funds to Spencer tomorrow morning. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The vintage was excellent, rich, and complex, a stark contrast to the transparent, desperate lies my parents were currently spinning. I let the silence stretch, watching them mistake my pause for submission. Spencer was nodding eagerly, a pathetic glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. He actually believed their authoritarian posturing was going to work. He actually thought I was going to fold. You mean the college trust fund? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly across the quiet room. The account you established when I was a child, which I never touched because I paid for my own tuition by working double shifts. Is that the trust fund you are referring to, Mom? Patricia lifted her chin defensively. Yes, that exact fund. The one holding $500,000 of our hard-earned money. We kept it active for you. We managed it for you. That is incredibly interesting, I replied, setting my glass down, because I received a very peculiar notification about that specific trust fund exactly 3 months ago. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, his face a mask of stubborn arrogance. I do not know what nonsense you are talking about. The trust is perfectly intact. Is it? I asked, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. Then you will not mind explaining why $500,000 was completely drained from that account on the 14th of September. The color instantly vanished from my mother's face. She looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Richard uncrossed his arms, his posture suddenly rigid, defensive, and undeniably guilty. I continued, my voice sharp and precise. I found it quite strange that the entire balance of my college fund was liquidated and immediately wired to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. And I found it even stranger when I traced that holding company back to an offshore gambling syndicate. Naomi let out a sharp intake of breath. She turned her fierce, prosecuting gaze toward Spencer, who was now visibly sweating, his hands trembling in his lap. Offshore gambling? Naomi demanded, her voice lethal. Spencer, what is she talking about? He could not answer. He was entirely paralyzed by the exposure of his secret vice. I kept my eyes pinned on my parents. Spencer racked up a $500,000 offshore gambling debt, I explained to the room, though I never broke eye contact with my father. And instead of letting your golden boy face the consequences of his own reckless actions, you decided to bail him out. But you did not use your own money, did you, Dad? Your liquidity is tied up in those failing commercial properties you co-signed with him. So you needed cash fast. Richard swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. You have no proof of anything, he stammered, his authoritarian facade crumbling into dust. I did not need to raise my voice. I already had them exactly where I wanted them. To access that specific trust fund, you needed my signature, I stated calmly. You needed my explicit authorized consent to liquidate those assets. But I never signed anything, which means, Mom, Dad, you forged my digital signature to steal $500,000 from my name to pay off a gambling syndicate for your degenerate son. Patricia opened her mouth, a desperate, breathless sound escaping her lips. Olivia, please, you have to understand. We were protecting him. Those people, they were threatening him. We had to act quickly. We were going to pay it back. You committed wire fraud, I corrected her, my tone devoid of any sympathy. You committed identity theft. You committed federal felonies to protect a man who just spent this entire dinner insulting my livelihood. Richard tried to rally his anger, though his voice shook. You are our daughter. You are not going to do anything about it. You would never turn your own parents in over a technicality. I offered him a cold, hollow smile. A technicality? That is a fascinating legal interpretation, Dad. Unfortunately, the federal government does not view forged digital signatures crossing international borders as a simple family technicality. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. You see, I mentioned casually brushing a piece of lint off my black dress. When I started building my software platform, I knew my digital security had to be flawless. I placed highly advanced multi-factor authentication alerts on all my personal and professional identities. When you forged my digital signature 3 months ago, you triggered an automatic flag. I did not just get an email notification. I have an active FBI fraud alert, tracking that specific digital signature, logging every single IP address and routing number involved in the transaction. Patricia let out a quiet, terrified sob, covering her mouth with both hands. Richard slumped back in his chair, the arrogant patriarch entirely defeated, staring at me as if I were a ghost. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been permanently and brutally annihilated. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was the executioner. I pushed my chair back from the table. No one even dared to speak. I stood up, smoothing my black dress, and picked up my clutch. Keep your $5,000, Spencer, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous dining room. Use it to hire a defense attorney. You are going to need one very soon. I turned my back and walked toward the foyer. My heels clicked a steady beat against the floorboards. I did not rush. As I reached the hallway and retrieved my coat, the paralyzing shock finally broke. The eruption of chaos was instantaneous. I slipped my arms into my coat, pausing for a moment in the shadows of the foyer to listen. Spencer Naomi's voice sliced through the air. It was the sharp, clinical tone of a litigator interrogating a hostile witness. Look at me right now. Naomi, please, Spencer begged, his voice cracking. Do not listen to her. Olivia is making this up to ruin Christmas. Stop lying to me, Naomi commanded, becoming dangerously quiet. I am a corporate attorney, Spencer. I recognize the smell of financial fraud. You have been feeding me fabricated profit margins for 6 months. I heard Spencer retreat toward the hallway, trying to escape her scrutiny. But Naomi was relentless. I want your corporate accounting books, Naomi stated, her words clipping the air. I want every single bank statement for your commercial real estate LLC on my desk by tomorrow morning. Honey, you cannot just audit your own husband? Spencer pleaded, practically whining now. If you co-mingled our personal marital assets with a bankrupt commercial venture, or if you tied my name to your offshore gambling debts, I will not just leave you. I will personally ensure you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Bring me the books, Spencer, or I am calling a forensic accountant tonight. While Naomi systematically dismantled Spencer in the hallway, complete panic consumed my parents back in the dining room. Their voices escalated into a frantic, terrified argument. The realization had finally sunk in. Their scapegoat daughter, the one they had mocked and dismissed for 33 years, now held the absolute power to send them both to federal prison. Richard, what are we going to do? Patricia wailed, her voice thick with hysteria. The FBI. She said the FBI has an alert. If they look into the trust fund transfer, they will see the routing numbers. They will see the IP addresses. We used the home computer, Richard. We used our own network to forge her signature. Keep your voice down. Richard hissed, though his own panic was entirely evident. Let me think. We just need to calm her down. She is our daughter. We will offer her a settlement. We will give her the house in the Hamptons. We will give her whatever she wants. She does not want the house in the Hamptons. Patricia sobbed loudly, the clinking of crystal indicating her desperate reach for her wine glass. She has $170 million in cash. She could buy the entire Hamptons if she wanted to. We cannot buy her off Richard. She has all the leverage. She is going to send us to jail. I cannot go to prison. I will not survive it. My friends at the country club will find out. The disgrace will kill me. Stop talking about the damn country club. Richard roared, his authoritarian mask completely obliterated by sheer terror. We committed wire fraud across international borders to pay off a gambling syndicate. Do you understand the federal sentencing guidelines for that? We are looking at 10 to 20 years. We need to hire a criminal defense lawyer immediately. We need to liquidate the remaining stock portfolios and prepare for a legal battle. But the stocks are tied up as collateral for Spencer's failing strip malls. Patricia cried out, her breathing becoming ragged and shallow. We leveraged everything to keep his business afloat. If his lenders foreclose, we lose this house. We lose everything, Richard. We are ruined. I stood in the foyer adjusting the collar of my coat, letting their terrified confessions wash over me. For years I had craved an apology from them. I had wanted them to recognize my worth, to validate my hard work, to simply treat me with basic human decency. But listening to their empire of lies collapse under the weight of its own corruption, I realized I no longer needed their validation. Their punishment was not something I even had to actively inflict. Their punishment was the natural, unavoidable consequence of their own unchecked greed and breathtaking arrogance. They had dug their own graves, and I had simply handed them the shovels. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. The cold metal felt grounding against my palm. I pulled the door open, letting the crisp, freezing winter air rush into the stifling, toxic atmosphere of the Bennett mansion. Behind me, the screaming continued. Naomi was demanding passwords. Spencer was sobbing. Patricia was having a full-blown panic attack, and Richard was shouting over all of them, desperately trying to salvage a sinking ship that had already been split entirely in half. I stepped out onto the front porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, cutting off the noise of their destruction with a satisfying final click. The night air was freezing, but I had never felt warmer. I walked down the long, sweeping stone driveway toward my waiting car, breathing in the fresh scent of pine. I did not look back at the grand illuminated house. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was leaving behind. I slipped into the leather of the driver's seat, pushed the ignition button, and started the powerful engine. I drove away into the quiet, beautiful starlit night, leaving the smoldering ruins of their utterly perfect fake facade far behind me forever. The crisp winter days following that explosive Christmas dinner were the most peaceful of my adult life. I spent the holiday weekend in my penthouse apartment overlooking the Manhattan skyline, ignoring the barrage of blocked calls from Connecticut area codes. The $170 million sat securely in my accounts, generating more interest in a single day than my parents made in a year. I was focused on the transition phase of my software company, transferring operational control to the executive team at Apex Holdings. It was standard post-acquisition protocol until my private line rang early Thursday morning. The caller ID showed David, the lead mergers and acquisitions attorney, who had brokered my deal with Apex Holdings. David was not a man who called before 9 in the morning unless millions of dollars were suddenly at risk. I answered on the first ring, expecting a minor clerical issue regarding the employee stock pool. Instead, David sounded unusually tense. He informed me that the compliance officers at Apex Holdings had just flagged a highly disturbing anonymous tip. According to their legal department, a series of emails and phone calls had been directed to their board of directors over the past 48 hours. The allegations were severe. The tipster claimed that the core proprietary algorithm of my supply chain platform was not written by me, but was actually stolen from an unnamed third-party developer I had supposedly contracted and subsequently defrauded. I listened to David outline the allegations, my coffee growing cold on the marble countertop. The claims were entirely fabricated, of course. I had written every single line of that initial code myself, locked in a damp basement fueled by cheap coffee and sheer desperation. But in the world of high-stakes tech acquisitions, the mere whisper of intellectual property theft is enough to trigger catastrophic legal contingencies. David explained that while the cash had already cleared my accounts, the acquisition contract contained standard indemnification and clawback clauses. If Apex Holdings believed there was a legitimate threat of copyright litigation, they could file an emergency injunction to freeze my payout pending a full forensic audit. They needed to protect their shareholders from buying stolen goods. I asked David who exactly was making these claims. He hesitated, noting that the emails came from encrypted proxy servers, but the phone calls had been traced back to a rather exclusive network of commercial real estate developers in the tri-state area. The realization hit me instantly. Spencer. My brother was not smart enough to execute a sophisticated cyber attack, but he was incredibly well connected in the old money circles of Connecticut and New York. He spent his days on the golf courses of the most elite country clubs, rubbing elbows with venture capitalists, board members, and corporate executives. He was leveraging his only remaining asset, his social network, to poison my reputation. Spencer knew he could not beat me in a fair fight, so he was trying to sabotage the foundation of my success. By planting rumors of stolen code among the very people who sat on the advisory boards of companies like Apex Holdings, he hoped to create enough panic to halt my financial momentum. He wanted to paralyze me with an asset freeze, locking up the $170 million so I could not use it to dismantle his failing real estate empire. It was a desperate, malicious play designed to force me into a corner. He figured that if my money was tied up in a massive corporate litigation battle, I would be terrified of losing the entire deal. My theory was confirmed less than an hour later. My personal cell phone chimed with a text message from an unregistered prepaid number. The syntax and arrogant tone were unmistakably Spencer. The message was brief and sickeningly smug. It read, "Looks like your new buyers are getting cold feet about your stolen code. Corporate lawsuits can drag on for years and drain every cent you have. I know the people making these claims. For $20 million, I can make them go away permanently. Consider it a consulting fee to save your deal. You have 24 hours to wire the funds or the real lawsuits drop." I stared at the glowing screen, marveling at his absolute stupidity. Spencer genuinely believed he was a master manipulator, executing a brilliant extortion plot. He thought he had outsmarted me by using his country club buddies to create a fake intellectual property crisis. He was trying to force a settlement demanding $20 million to fix a problem he had entirely fabricated. He needed that exact amount to cover his offshore gambling debts and save his commercial properties from foreclosure. Instead of feeling fear, I felt a deep, profound sense of focus. I took a screenshot of his extortion demand and forwarded it directly to David. I instructed my legal team to cooperate fully with the Apex Holdings compliance officers, offering them complete unrestricted access to my original developer logs, time-stamped code repositories, and version control histories dating back 10 years. I had nothing to hide, and paper trails do not lie. Spencer, however, had just documented his own attempt at corporate extortion across state lines. He had left a digital footprint connecting his demand for $20 million directly to the anonymous smear campaign designed to defraud a major corporate acquisition. I did not reply to his text. I simply poured my cold coffee down the sink and smiled, knowing he had just handed me the final nail for his coffin. The panic that had consumed him after the Christmas dinner had clearly pushed him over the edge of rational thought, blinding him to the severe legal consequences of his actions. He was playing simple checkers while I was playing a highly advanced game of corporate chess on a massive global scale, and he was about to permanently lose absolutely everything he had ever been given. The very next afternoon, my building concierge called to inform me a process server was waiting in the lobby. I told the security staff to send him up. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were far too obsessed with control to walk away. They needed $20 million to save their golden child, and they were going to try every manipulative tactic to rip it from my hands. The server handed me a thick envelope. I thanked him, closed the door, and carried the packet to my kitchen island. I sliced the top open and slid the documents onto the marble counter. The header told me everything I needed to know about my parents' strategy. They had not hired a prestigious Manhattan corporate firm. They obviously could not afford one, and no respectable intellectual property lawyer would ever touch their baseless claims. Instead, they had hired Gordon Maxwell, an aggressive personal injury attorney based out of a strip mall in suburban Connecticut. He was famous for late-night television ads shouting at the camera about getting clients the maximum cash settlements they deserved. He was a bully in a cheap suit entirely unequipped for the complexities of a multi-million-dollar tech acquisition. The document itself was a masterpiece of legal absurdity dramatically titled, "Cease and Desist and Notice of Imminent Asset Freeze." I leaned over the counter, fighting the urge to laugh out loud at the desperation dripping from every paragraph. The demand letter claimed that my software platform, the supply chain management system I had just sold to Apex Holdings, was actually classified as family intellectual property. The legal justification Gordon Maxwell concocted was breathtakingly stupid. The document argued that because I wrote the earliest iterations of my code 10 years ago, while residing in the unfinished basement of my parents' home, they were entitled to an ownership stake. The letter went into agonizing detail. It stated my parents had provided the electricity that was powering my laptop. It claimed they had provided the internet connection I used to research coding frameworks. It even had the audacity to list the groceries I had eaten from their kitchen as direct seed capital investments in my startup. Because I consumed Bennett family resources during the inception phase of my business, Richard and Patricia were now legally claiming co-founder status. It was a flimsy, desperate reach. Any first-year law student knows that living in a house does not automatically grant the homeowner intellectual property rights to the ideas generated under their roof, especially without a signed contract, non-disclosure agreement, or equity-sharing document. But my parents were not relying on legal precedent. They were relying purely on psychological intimidation. The final page contained the ridiculous ultimatum. Gordon Maxwell warned that unless I complied with their demands immediately, he would file a massive lawsuit in state court the following Monday morning. He threatened to petition a judge for an emergency injunction to freeze my entire $170 million payout, arguing that the funds were the proceeds of stolen family assets. He promised a highly public legal battle that would drag my professional name through the mud and destroy my relationship with my new corporate buyers. However, the letter stated my parents were willing to be merciful. In the spirit of family forgiveness, they would generously agree to waive all their rightful ownership claims and drop the impending lawsuit entirely. All I had to do was sign the attached settlement agreement and wire a one-time non-refundable payment of exactly $20 million to Gordon Maxwell's trust account within 48 hours. $20 million. The exact same number Spencer had demanded in his anonymous extortion text just a single day earlier. I picked up the documents, walking to the windows looking over the bustling city. My parents and my brother were perfectly coordinated. Spencer was running a shadow campaign trying to spook my buyers with rumors of stolen code, while Richard and Patricia were executing a frontal assault, threatening a bogus lawsuit claiming the exact same thing. They were squeezing me from both sides, convinced that the sheer pressure of a public scandal would force me to cave and hand over the cash they needed to save Spencer from financial ruin. They thought I was still the scared, isolated girl they used to relentlessly bully at the dinner table. They thought that angry legal jargon would send me spiraling into submission. I walked to my desk, scanned the document, and emailed it directly to David and my team of elite corporate litigators. Within 10 minutes, my phone rang. It was David, and I could hear several other senior partners laughing in the background of his conference room. Olivia. David chuckled, his voice echoing through the speakerphone. Please tell me your parents did not actually pay a real lawyer to draft this garbage. It reads like a cheap television script. The jurisdiction is completely wrong. The intellectual property claims are completely ungrounded. And the threat of an asset freeze based on a grocery bill from a decade ago is borderline sanctionable behavior. They are extremely desperate. David, I replied. my voice remaining perfectly steady and cold. And extremely desperate people always make massive, highly documented mistakes. I explicitly instructed my legal team not to respond to Gordon Maxwell in any capacity. I did not want to send a formal rebuttal. I did not want to threaten a countersuit yet. I wanted complete and utter radio silence. Let my parents and their sleazy strip mall attorney stew in the quiet anxiety of waiting. Let them blindly believe their pathetic intimidation tactic was actually working. Let their overwhelming arrogance blind them to the massive trap that was slowly and inevitably closing around them. I needed them to feel victorious for just a few more days, because while they were busy playing games with fake lawsuits, I was quietly gathering the lethal ammunition needed for a real financial execution. While I was setting my trap from a penthouse in Manhattan 50 miles away in Connecticut, my sister-in-law was executing a quiet, ruthless investigation. Naomi was not the type of woman to sit in the dark waiting for her husband to explain a financial discrepancy. She was a senior associate at a corporate law firm trained to dissect financial structures and uncover hidden liabilities. The moment she returned home from that disastrous Christmas dinner, she did not cry or demand explanations from Spencer. She simply locked herself in her home office, opened her laptop, and went to work. Spencer had always kept his business accounting separated from their joint household finances, falsely claiming his real estate ventures were too complicated for standard bookkeeping. For 3 years, Naomi had trusted him, respecting the boundary because she maintained her own separate accounts, fueled by her substantial legal salary. But trust is a fragile luxury that evaporates the instant a lie is exposed. I had shattered that trust with a single sentence at the dinner table. Now Naomi was using her premium legal database subscriptions to pull every single public record tax filing and corporate registration associated with the Bennett name. What she found over the next 48 hours was a sprawling, chaotic web of absolute financial ruin. Spencer did not actually own a successful real estate empire. He secretly owned a series of shell companies, each one carrying massive amounts of toxic, high-interest debt. He was playing a dangerous game of financial musical chairs, taking out loans from one predatory commercial lender to simply pay the minimum interest on another. The strip malls he bragged about acquiring were bleeding cash, suffering from terrible mismanagement and vacant storefronts. His corporate accounts were not just empty, they were severely overdrawn. Naomi traced the money trail with ruthless, clinical precision. She uncovered the offshore gambling transfers I had mentioned, verifying that Spencer was actively bleeding capital to illegal syndicates in the Caribbean. But the gambling was only a fraction of the problem. As she dug deeper into the public registry of deeds, checking for liens and judgments against his limited liability companies, a cold, creeping sense of dread began to wash over her. She expanded her search parameters, moving away from his business entities and running a highly specific query on her own personal identification number, just to be absolutely thorough. Naomi owned a stunning historic brownstone in Boston. She had purchased it on her own, using the massive bonus from her very first major corporate litigation victory long before she ever met Spencer. It was her private sanctuary, her premarital asset, strictly protected and legally kept completely separate from their marriage. Or so she thought. When the search results populated on her glowing screen, the blood drained entirely from her face. There, registered with the county clerk just 6 months prior, was a massive encumbrance on her property. A commercial lender had filed a lien against her historic brownstone. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She requested the certified copies of the loan origination documents, paying the expedited processing fee without a second thought. A few tense minutes later, a detailed PDF downloaded directly to her desktop. Naomi opened the file and began to read the dense, confusing legal jargon. It was a secondary mortgage agreement. Someone had taken out a high-risk loan, using the equity in her Boston property as collateral. The funds from that loan had been deposited directly into one of Spencer's failing shell companies. Naomi scrolled down to the signature page at the bottom of the document. She needed to see who authorized this catastrophic transaction. There printed in black ink was her own name. But the signature resting on the line above it was wrong. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen strokes the loop of the vowels, none of it belonged to her. It was a crude, rushed, amateurish forgery. Spencer had not just lied to her about his business success. He had committed premeditated financial fraud against his own wife to artificially prop up his dying ego project. To make the document legally binding, Spencer had utilized a public notary. Naomi examined the notary stamp pressed next to her forged signature. She recognized the name instantly. It was a junior administrative assistant who worked daily at the front desk of Spencer's real estate office. He had clearly manipulated or blatantly bribed his own employee to illegally notarize a document for a woman who was not even in the room. The sheer, staggering audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Spencer had literally stolen the very roof over her head, gambling her future security on his worthless, failing commercial properties. Naomi sat back in her office chair, staring at the glowing screen. A lesser woman might have broken down into tears, overwhelmed by the betrayal. But Naomi did not weep. She felt a sudden, terrifying sense of absolute clarity. Every late night Spencer claimed to be working, every sudden overnight business trip, every single time he actively avoided discussing their long-term financial planning, it all snapped into perfect, devastating focus. She was married to a ruthless con artist. He was a parasitic leech who had attached himself to her success because he was entirely incapable of generating his own. She printed 2 copies of the forged mortgage documents and placed them carefully inside a locked briefcase. She did not march out of her office to confront him. She knew that screaming at a liar only gives them an opportunity to invent better lies. Instead, she smoothed her expression into a mask of unbothered calm. She needed an ally who understood how deeply toxic the Bennett men truly were. She needed someone who possessed the overwhelming financial firepower to completely annihilate her husband. Naomi picked up her cell phone, bypassed her regular contacts list, and directly dialed my private number. The call came through just as I was reviewing the latest acquisition transition files. I recognized Naomi's number immediately. We had never spoken outside of mandatory family events, and she was not the type to call for a casual chat. I answered on the second ring. She did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She simply asked if I was in Manhattan and if I had time for a meeting that afternoon. Her voice was stripped of any familial warmth, sounding exactly like the elite corporate litigator she was. I told her to meet me at a discreet private member cafe, tucked away in the Upper East Side, a place where people went to conduct high-level business without the risk of being overheard. I arrived first, securing a booth in the back corner surrounded by sound-dampening panels. Naomi walked in exactly on time. She wore a tailored suit and carried a structured briefcase. Her expression was completely unreadable. There were no red eyes, no trembling hands, and absolutely no signs of an emotional breakdown. She slid into the booth across from me and ordered an espresso. We were 2 highly intelligent, pragmatic women who had both been targeted by the exact same toxic family system, and we were about to dismantle it together. "You were right about the bankruptcy," Naomi stated, getting straight to the point the moment the waiter stepped away. "He is severely overleveraged. But it is worse than just failing commercial properties. He forged my signature on a secondary mortgage to drain the equity from my brownstone in Boston." I did not gasp or offer empty sympathies. I simply nodded, respecting her composure. "Spencer has always been a coward who steals from women," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "My parents let him get away with it his entire life. But stealing from a corporate attorney was his fatal mistake." Naomi opened her briefcase and handed me the forged mortgage documents. "I want to build an airtight fraud case," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "But I need to know the full extent of the damage before I file the divorce papers. I need to know exactly how deep his financial grave goes, and I figure the woman who just sold a tech empire for $170 million might have the resources to find out." She was absolutely correct. While my parents and Spencer were busy drafting their pathetic fake intellectual property lawsuit, I had instructed my wealth management team to run a comprehensive forensic background check on my brother. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, heavily redacted manila folder. I placed it on the table and slid it across the polished mahogany surface toward her. I had my team pull everything I explained, watching her open the folder. The bankruptcy is just the surface layer, Naomi. The strip malls are bleeding cash, yes, but that is not where all the missing capital went. Look at the highlighted bank transfers on page 4. Naomi flipped to the designated page. Her sharp eyes scanned the rows of financial data. I watched her perfectly neutral expression tighten for just a fraction of a second as she processed the information. There were dozens of recurring wire transfers. They were not going to construction contractors or commercial lenders. They were going directly into a checking account registered to a luxury condominium in Miami. Spencer does not own any property in Florida, Naomi stated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. No, he does not, I confirmed. But a 24-year-old fitness instructor named Amber certainly does. Spencer has been paying her rent, her credit card bills, and funding their weekend getaways to South Beach for the last 14 months. He used the cash he stole from your brownstone to finance a secret second life. Naomi stared at the bank statements. They are trying to extort $20 million from me to save his failing company. They are incredibly arrogant right now, believing they have me cornered. I am setting up a maneuver to legally acquire all of his defaulted commercial debt. By next week, I will be his sole creditor. I will hold the mortgages to his business, his cars, and the Connecticut mansion my parents live in. Naomi processed the strategy instantly, her legal mind recognizing the sheer brilliance of the trap. You are going to foreclose on your own family. I am going to evict them from their delusions, I corrected. But I need perfect timing. I need them to gather in his office, thinking I am bringing them a settlement check. When I drop the foreclosure notices, I want you to walk through those doors and serve him the divorce papers and the fraud charges. A synchronized, inescapable takedown. Naomi picked up her espresso, her dark eyes flashing with cold anticipation. She raised her cup in a silent toast. Using a private banking contact, Naomi opened 3 new isolated accounts under a newly established single-member limited liability company. She immediately rerouted her substantial partnership distributions, her quarterly bonuses, and her direct deposit salary away from their joint marital accounts. With a few swift calculated keystrokes, she transferred every available cent of her personal liquid cash into the new fortress she had just built. She left the joint checking account with exactly $1,000, just enough to ensure scheduled utility payments would not bounce and trigger a premature panic from Spencer. Next, she attacked the legal paperwork. Naomi did not use standard divorce templates. She drafted an ironclad, merciless petition for dissolution of marriage. Every paragraph was a weapon. She meticulously detailed the dissipation of marital assets, citing the offshore gambling wire transfers I had provided. She structured the document to ensure Spencer would be utterly stripped of any claim to her future earnings, her retirement accounts, and her premarital property. But a simple divorce was not enough to protect her physical and financial safety. Naomi drafted an ex parte emergency motion for a temporary restraining order. In many jurisdictions, financial abuse of this magnitude, specifically the fraudulent leveraging of a spouse primary residence to fund illicit offshore activities, qualified as severe domestic abuse. She attached the forensic evidence of the forged notary stamp, explicitly demonstrating that Spencer possessed both the capability and the reckless intent to completely destroy her financial identity. A judge would review this and immediately recognize a dangerous, desperate man who needed to be legally barred from coming anywhere near her or her remaining assets. She placed the finished documents into a secure file ready to be filed with the clerk of the court the exact morning of our coordinated strike. Concurrently, less than 30 blocks away in a high-security financial suite, my wealth management team was executing an aggressive, highly complex maneuver of their own. I sat at the head of a long marble conference table, flanked by three senior debt acquisition specialists. We were not building a legal case. We were engineering a hostile financial takeover. When commercial real estate developers like my brother default on their obligations, their lenders panic. Banks despise carrying toxic non-performing loans on their balance sheets. It negatively impacts their quarterly reporting and ties up valuable capital. They are almost always willing to sell those bad debts to third-party collection firms or private equity groups for pennies on the dollar just to wash their hands of the liability. I instructed my team to exploit that exact desperation. We established a blind, anonymous holding company registered in Delaware. We named it Obsidian Capital Management. By using a proxy entity, we ensured that neither Spencer nor his lenders would ever know that Olivia Bennett was the actual source of the incoming capital. My lead acquisition manager systematically contacted the three primary commercial lenders holding Spencer outstanding mortgages. As expected, they were thrilled to hear from a motivated buyer. Spencer had missed 2 consecutive quarterly payments, and his commercial strip malls were hemorrhaging anchor tenants. The banks viewed his portfolio as a total loss. Obsidian Capital Management swooped in and offered to purchase the entirety of Spencer commercial debt portfolio in a single all-cash transaction. We negotiated ruthlessly, buying the bad debt at a steep discount. But I did not care about the discount. I cared about the underlying collateral. When you purchase a debt, you purchase all the accompanying guarantees and liens attached to it. My team meticulously reviewed the promissory notes Spencer had signed. Just as I suspected, his initial business loans were deeply intertwined with our parents' finances. Richard and Patricia, blinded by their unwavering faith in their golden child, had signed personal guarantees. They had put up their own assets as collateral to secure his commercial lines of credit. Within 48 hours, the wire transfers cleared. The commercial banks joyfully signed over the deeds of trust, the promissory notes, and the personal guarantees directly to Obsidian Capital Management. The legal transfer of power was absolute and irreversible. I stood up from the conference table and looked at the stack of finalized contracts. The trap was now fully constructed, armed, and ready to snap shut. Spencer no longer owed money to a faceless banking institution, willing to negotiate extensions or accept partial payments. He owed money to me. I owned the mortgages on his failing strip malls. I owned the liens on his imported luxury vehicles. And most importantly, I legally owned the debt secured by my parents' sprawling Connecticut mansion. I was now the sole creditor and ultimate master of the Bennett family financial existence. The 5-day countdown we agreed upon in the coffee shop was rapidly approaching its end. Naomi had secured her escape route and readied her legal missiles. I had successfully acquired the entire foundation of my family wealth. Spencer sat in his leased office, entirely oblivious to the silent, synchronized machinery moving in the darkness to crush him. He believed he was the predator, eagerly waiting for his sister to cave to his pathetic extortion demands. He had absolutely no idea that he was already dead, just waiting for the exact moment the ground would finally open up and swallow him entirely. The silence from my legal team was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. It was driving Spencer into a state of euphoric arrogance. In his mind, my refusal to respond to his strip mall attorney meant only one thing. He believed I was paralyzed by fear. He thought the mighty tech CEO was cowering in her Manhattan penthouse, desperately trying to figure out how to save her $170 million acquisition from his brilliant legal maneuvering. He genuinely believed that his crude extortion plot was working perfectly. Back in his overpriced, severely underperforming commercial office space, Spencer was already celebrating. I could easily picture him leaning back in his leather executive chair, his feet propped up on a mahogany desk he had purchased using our parents' retirement funds. He was likely staring at his phone, waiting for my inevitable surrender. His commercial real estate empire was literally crumbling around him. He had missed payroll for his small staff. The utilities for his primary office building were 3 days away from being shut off due to non-payment. His offshore gambling creditors were likely breathing down his neck, sending threatening messages that made his stomach churn. But Spencer did not care about reality. He only cared about the fantasy he was constructing in his head. He picked up his cell phone and decided to apply what he considered to be maximum pressure. He opened our text message thread, which had remained completely dormant since his first anonymous extortion attempt. He typed out a message with the reckless confidence of a man who has never once been held accountable for his own actions. The notification lit up my phone screen while I was reviewing the final debt transfer documents from Obsidian Capital Management. I unlocked the device and read his message. "Time is running out," little sister Spencer wrote. "Your new corporate buyers have been asking a lot of questions about your intellectual property. It would be a massive shame if this entire acquisition fell apart because you were too stubborn to pay what you owe this family. You have exactly 24 hours to sign the settlement agreement and wire the $20 million to Gordon Maxwell. If the funds do not clear by tomorrow morning, the lawsuit goes public. You will face total public ruin. Do not test me." I read the text message twice, a cold smile spreading across my face. His sheer stupidity was truly a marvel to behold. He had just handed me written documentation of a secondary extortion attempt, practically begging the federal authorities to launch a wire fraud investigation. He was threatening to destroy my reputation while completely oblivious to the fact that his own wife was currently finalizing the legal paperwork to destroy his entire existence. I did not feel an ounce of anxiety. I felt the absolute undeniable thrill of total victory. The trap was perfectly set. The steel jaws were open and the prey had voluntarily stepped onto the pressure plate. I placed my phone on my desk and stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I looked out over the sprawling city, watching the tiny cars navigate the grid below. I thought about my parents, Patricia and Richard. I knew exactly what they were doing at this very moment. They were probably sitting in their Connecticut mansion, sipping expensive wine, congratulating themselves on raising such a shrewd, brilliant businessman. They were likely planning how they would spend their portion of the $20 million they were attempting to steal from me. They probably thought they could use my money to pay off Spencer's debts, salvage their precious country club reputation, and continue living their hollow, pathetic lives as if nothing had ever happened. They believed they could forge my digital signature, steal $500,000 from my college trust fund, and extort another $20 million without facing a single repercussion. Their entitlement was a terminal disease, and I was holding the cure. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. It was time to give Spencer exactly what he wanted. It was time to validate his massive ego, to inflate his sense of superiority so large that the impending explosion would leave absolutely nothing behind. I opened the messaging application and typed out my reply. I did not use capital letters. I did not use exclamation points. I kept the tone flat, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. "I will bring the paperwork tomorrow at 10 in the morning to your office," I typed. "Make sure Mom and Dad are there. Bring a pen." I pressed send and placed the phone face down on the desk. I knew exactly what would happen the second that message delivered. Spencer would jump out of his leather chair. He would let out a loud, triumphant cheer. He would immediately call Richard and Patricia, bragging about how he had broken me. He would tell them his brilliant legal strategy had forced the arrogant tech CEO to her knees. He would instruct them to put on their best suits and drive down to his office the next morning to witness his absolute victory. He would tell them to get ready to collect a $20 million check. He thought I was coming to his office to surrender. He thought I was bringing a signed settlement agreement and a bank wire confirmation. He thought tomorrow was going to be the greatest day of his miserable life. I gathered the thick stack of foreclosure notices, asset seizure documents, and commercial default judgments into my leather briefcase. I locked the brass clasps with a snap. Tomorrow at 10 in the morning, Spencer Bennett was going to learn a hard lesson about how the real world operates. He was going to learn that actions have consequences. He was going to learn that actions have consequences. But that lesson required absolute precision. The execution of my plan did not begin on the morning of our scheduled meeting. It had been finalized 24 hours earlier in a room that Spencer could never even dream of entering. While my brother popped cheap champagne in his leased office, I sat 50 stories above Manhattan in the executive boardroom of Apex Holdings. The boardroom was a masterpiece of modern corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the financial district. The conference table was carved from a single slab of black marble. There were no raised voices here, no pathetic boasts or desperate threats. There was only the quiet hum of billions of dollars changing hands. I sat at the head of the table. To my right was David, my lead mergers and acquisitions attorney. To my left sat the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings and their general counsel. They had called this emergency meeting to address the anonymous intellectual property theft allegations Spencer had attempted to plant. They had deployed their top forensic software engineers to audit my entire platform. It took them less than 4 hours to verify what I already knew. Every single line of code was completely original, time-stamped, and legally registered to my name. Spencer's amateurish smear campaign had evaporated the moment it touched the blazing heat of actual corporate due diligence. The Apex CEO, a silver-haired veteran of the tech industry, closed the audit file and slid it across the marble table. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly impressed. "The allegations are entirely baseless," the CEO stated, his voice a low rumble. "Your architecture is flawless, Olivia. But what fascinates me is not the failed sabotage attempt. What fascinates me is how you have chosen to respond." He gestured to a secondary stack of documents sitting in front of David. "When we wired the $170 million into your accounts, we naturally assumed you would transfer it into low-risk municipal bonds or a diversified index portfolio," the general counsel added, leaning forward. "Instead, our compliance monitors flagged a massive capital deployment through a newly formed blind proxy entity in Delaware. Obsidian Capital Management." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. "You monitored my post-acquisition capital allocation. Standard protocol when an anonymous tip suggests financial irregularities," the CEO replied smoothly. "We had to ensure you were not liquidating assets to flee a potential lawsuit. But you were not fleeing, you were buying." I did not break eye contact. I was executing a standard financial strategy. David smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. "Standard is certainly one word for it. Brutal is another." The Apex executives had figured it out. They had traced the money from Obsidian Capital Management directly to the commercial lenders holding Spencer's toxic loans. They understood exactly what I was doing. The strategy is called distressed debt acquisition. When a commercial developer defaults on their mortgages, their debt becomes a toxic liability for the issuing bank. The bank wants that bad debt off their balance sheet. A savvy investor with enough liquid cash can step in and buy those loans from the bank for pennies on the dollar. But I did not negotiate for a discount. I paid the banks exactly what Spencer owed them, plus a premium for expedited processing. I did not want to save money. I wanted absolute, unquestionable ownership of the collateral. "You bought every single outstanding commercial note tied to your brother's limited liability companies," the Apex CEO said, genuine respect lacing his words. "You acquired the mortgages on his retail properties, the liens on his corporate vehicles, and the personal guarantees signed by your parents." "That is correct," I replied calmly. The general counsel shook his head in disbelief. "You did not just buy his debt. You bought his entire financial existence. You are now the sole senior creditor for his business and your parents' personal estate." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a gold fountain pen. "I am a firm believer in cleaning up my own messes," I told the executives. "My family attempted to extort me. They threatened to disrupt this acquisition. I am simply removing their ability to ever threaten me or this company again." David slid the final transfer deeds across the marble table. The commercial banks had already signed their portions. The only thing missing was my signature as the sole managing director of Obsidian Capital Management. I uncapped the pen. The room was dead silent. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I signed my name with precise, elegant strokes. With that ink, I legally took possession of my brother's failing empire and the roof over my parents' heads. The Apex CEO watched me cap the pen. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Remind me to never negotiate against you in the future, Olivia. You have nothing to worry about, I assured him, standing up from the table and sliding the executed deeds into my briefcase. As long as you never try to steal from me. I walked out of the Apex Holdings boardroom with the full backing of a massive tech conglomerate and the legal documentation required to annihilate my family. That was yesterday. It was Friday morning. The dashboard clock read 9:45. My private driver pulled the black town car up to the curb outside the glass facade of Spencer's office building. I stepped out onto the pavement, the cold morning air biting at my cheeks. My three attorneys stepped out of the trailing vehicle, their dark suits and leather briefcases, signaling a corporate execution. I checked my watch. I had 15 minutes to bring my family the reality check they had been begging for. I took a deep breath, adjusted my jacket, and walked through the doors. The lobby of the commercial high-rise was a monument to corporate vanity. It was all cold marble, polished steel, and towering glass panels that reflected the gray morning sky. I strode past the security desk without breaking my pace, my heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the floor. Behind me, my three attorneys followed in perfect synchronization. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of men who dismantled empires for a living. We stepped into the elevator, and I pressed the button for the top floor. Spencer had leased the penthouse suite. It was an incredibly arrogant financial decision for a startup real estate firm, but my brother never cared about practical business metrics. He only cared about the illusion of success. He wanted his clients to step off the elevator and feel intimidated by his wealth. But as the silver doors slid open, the cracks in his illusion were immediately obvious. The reception desk, an absurdly expensive custom piece carved from reclaimed walnut, was completely abandoned. The phones were not ringing. The sleek modern waiting area was totally empty. There were no junior associates bustling down the hallways with architectural blueprints. The entire office suite felt like a hollow, deserted movie set. Spencer had likely laid off his remaining staff weeks ago to save cash, or they had simply stopped showing up when their paychecks started bouncing. I led my team down the main corridor toward the executive corner office. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, and the unmistakable sound of clinking crystal drifted into the silent hallway. I held up my hand, signaling my lawyers to pause. I wanted to listen for just a moment. I wanted to capture a mental snapshot of their absolute delusion before I burned it to the ground. I told you she would crack. Spencer boasted, his voice echoing loudly from inside the office. It was just a matter of applying the right amount of pressure. You hit her with that intellectual property lawsuit, and I squeezed her from the industry side. She panicked. It was a flawless execution. You handled it perfectly, son. Richard replied, his tone thick with patriarchal pride. She has always been too emotional for high-stakes business. She got lucky with that software idea, but she lacks the stomach for real corporate warfare. She needed a firm hand to remind her of her actual place in this family. Now we can finally put this ugly chapter behind us and get your commercial developments back on track. And we can finish the renovations on the Connecticut house. Patricia chimed in, her voice slurred slightly. I am thinking we completely gut the conservatory. I saw the most marvelous imported Italian tile last week. Pour me another splash of that Macallan Spencer. We have a lot to celebrate today. I glanced at my watch. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. My parents and my brother were sitting in a failing empty office drinking top-shelf scotch before lunch, gleefully planning how they were going to spend the $20 million they were currently attempting to extort from their own flesh and blood. They were completely insulated by their own arrogance, genuinely convinced that their crude bullying tactics had brought a tech CEO to her knees. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt an overwhelming sense of clinical detachment. They were no longer my family. They were simply a hostile liability that required immediate liquidation. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the executive suite. The office was designed to look like a throne room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city. Spencer sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his feet casually propped up on the polished wood. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than his monthly lease payment. Richard sat in a leather club chair, holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. Patricia was perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, dressed to the nines, in a tailored tweed suit and her signature diamond necklace. They froze the instant I walked into the room. The celebration abruptly died. Spencer slowly took his feet off the desk, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his perfectly groomed face. "Look who finally decided to join the real world," Spencer sneered, setting his scotch glass down next to a silver pen holder. "Right on time, too." "Time. I always knew you were a punctual girl when push came to shove." My three attorneys stepped into the office behind me. They fanned out slightly, their expressions utterly devoid of emotion. They wore identical dark charcoal suits and carried thick leather briefcases. They looked like undertakers arriving at a corporate funeral. Richard shifted in his leather chair, his eyes darting toward the three men. He puffed out his chest, trying to project dominance. "You brought an entire legal entourage just to hand over a settlement check, Olivia. That seems a bit dramatic even for you. But I suppose you want to make sure the release of claims is properly filed." "Do not worry, Gordon Maxwell reviewed all the paperwork. Once the wire transfer clears, the family lawsuit goes away." Patricia took another sip of her scotch, waving her hand dismissively. "Let her have her little dramatic entrance, Richard. As long as she brought the documents and the routing numbers, we can conclude this business." "Have a seat, Olivia. There is no need to stand there glaring at us. We are all adults here." I did not sit down. I did not move toward the empty leather chair positioned in front of Spencer's desk. I remained standing exactly where I was, flanked by my legal team, staring at the three of them with eyes as cold as dead space. I simply folded my arms. Spencer sighed loudly. "Well, open those briefcases now. We have completely run out of patience for you." My lead attorney stepped forward, his hand moving toward the brass latch of his leather briefcase. Spencer held up his hand, his palm facing outward in a sharp, commanding gesture. "Stop right there," he ordered, his voice echoing in the large office. "There is no need to rush the paperwork just yet." Spencer rounded his massive mahogany desk and began to pace across the expensive wool rug. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his tailored trousers and used the other to gesture broadly, taking center stage. He was entirely in his element, preparing to deliver the kind of self-indulgent, condescending speech he probably practiced in front of his bathroom mirror every morning. Before we get to the signatures and the wire transfers, Spencer began, his tone dripping with a sickeningly paternalistic edge. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about reality, Olivia. I know you are feeling a bit bruised right now. I know you think Mom and Dad and I played a little rough with the lawsuit threat. But you have to understand that we did it for your own good. We had to force your hand because you were completely out of your depth." I kept my hands folded neatly together and made sure my expression remained blank and unresponsive. I did not interrupt his ridiculous monologue. I wanted to stand there and hear exactly how he internally justified his blatant, unhinged attempt at criminal extortion against his own flesh and blood. "Let us be perfectly honest with each other," Spencer continued, stopping to lean against the edge of his desk. "You got incredibly lucky. You built a little inventory tracking app, and a massive tech conglomerate happened to be desperate enough to throw a ridiculous amount of money at you. Good for you, truly. But getting the money is one thing. Keeping it is an entirely different game. A game you do not know how to play." He took a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch, letting the golden liquid linger before swallowing. $170 million is a staggering amount of capital, Olivia. It is complex. It requires aggressive risk management, tax sheltering, asset allocation, and real estate diversification. That is not something a single woman with a background in writing code can just figure out on the fly. It is simply too much money for an emotional, inexperienced girl to handle on her own. You would be swindled by Wall Street sharks within a year. You would lose everything. My father. Richard nodded vigorously from his leather club chair. He swirled the ice in his glass, his chest puffed out with patriarchal pride. Your brother is absolutely right, Olivia. Richard proclaimed, his voice thick with unearned authority. The financial markets are ruthless. They are dominated by men who eat naive young women alive. What Spencer is offering you today is a lifeline. By paying that $20 million settlement, you are not just getting rid of a family intellectual property dispute. You are paying for expert male financial stewardship. I watched my father take a sip of his drink, his eyes gleaming with absolute conviction. He genuinely believed his own toxic rhetoric. You should be thanking us, Richard insisted, pointing a thick finger in my direction. We are stepping in to manage the heavy lifting. Spencer has the real-world commercial experience. He understands market leverage and institutional debt. He will take that $20 million and multiply it through tangible assets. He is protecting the Bennett legacy. It is your fundamental duty as a daughter to support the family structure. You provide the raw capital and the men in the family provide the strategic vision. That is how generational wealth is preserved. Patricia smiled from the velvet sofa, her diamond necklace sparkling under the recessed lighting. Listen to your father, Olivia, she added, her voice slurred but eager. Men just have a natural instinct for these things. Why burden yourself with all that stressful financial planning when your brother is perfectly willing to take it off your hands? You can finally relax. You can focus on finding a nice husband, maybe buy a house in the suburbs, and leave the corporate warfare to Spencer. We are actually doing you a massive favor. I stood motionless, flanked by my 3 silent attorneys, letting their staggering misogyny wash over me in waves. The sheer suffocating density of their arrogance was almost physically repulsive. They were entirely broke. They were facing total, undeniable financial ruin. Spencer had fraudulently leveraged his own wife's premarital home, gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars to illicit offshore syndicates, and completely missed payroll for his own empty hollow office. Yet here he stood before me in a bespoke suit lecturing a self-made tech founder about the importance of expert financial stewardship. Spencer resumed his pacing, his ego swelling to absolute maximum capacity. He clearly interpreted my silence as submission. He thought my lack of argument meant his words were finally penetrating my supposedly fragile feminine mind. Think of the $20 million as an insurance policy, Spencer concluded, stopping right in front of me. You pay the fee today, the lawsuit vanishes, and you get the benefit of my continued financial oversight. If you ever need advice on where to park your remaining cash, my door is always open. I will even give you a family discount on the consultation fees. He smiled a wide, predatory grin that showcased all of his expensive, perfectly veneered white teeth. He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly relishing the sound of his own voice echoing in the quiet room. He looked past me directly at my lead attorney and gave a curt, impatient nod. All right then, Spencer said, clapping his hands together once. I think she finally understands the harsh reality of her situation. You can go ahead and open the briefcase now. Let us get the settlement agreement signed and process the incoming wire transfer. I did not blink. I simply turned my head toward the lead attorney standing to my right. He understood the silent command. He stepped forward, bridging the short distance to the edge of Spencer's massive mahogany desk. He lifted his heavy leather briefcase and set it down in the center of the polished wood, pushing aside a silver letter opener. The dull thud of the leather hitting the desk echoed in the cavernous office. Spencer leaned over, his eyes gleaming with unrestrained greed. Richard shifted to the very edge of his leather club chair, eagerly craning his neck to get a better view. Patricia actually clapped her hands together, a short sound of pure delight, her diamond necklace catching the overhead light as she leaned forward on the velvet sofa. They were completely convinced they had won. They were expecting a checkbook. They were expecting a single sheet of paper outlining a settlement agreement. They were expecting the swift transfer of $20 million into their waiting hands. My attorney unfastened the brass clasps. They opened with two loud metallic snaps that cut through the heavy anticipation in the room. He lifted the leather lid and reached inside. He did not pull out a checkbook. He did not pull out a wire transfer authorization form. He pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of legal files. Each file was bound in thick manila folders and stamped across the front with bright, aggressive red ink. The attorney lifted the heavy stack with both hands and dropped it directly onto the center of Spencer's desk. The sound it made was heavy, authoritative, and completely final. Spencer frowned, his triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the mountain of paperwork, his brow furrowing in confusion. This was not a simple settlement agreement. This was hundreds of pages of dense, tightly bound corporate litigation. "What is all this?" Spencer asked, his voice losing a bit of its arrogant edge. "I told you Gordon Maxwell already drafted the settlement release. You just needed to sign the single page and authorize the funds. We do not need to complicate this with whatever massive corporate counter-agreement your overpaid lawyers drummed up. Just give me the check, Olivia. Let us not drag this out all day." I kept my hands folded and my posture perfectly straight. "There is no check, Spencer," I said, my voice ringing out cold and clear in the silent office. "And I am not here to negotiate a settlement. I suggest you read the red stamp on the top folder." Spencer let out a short, frustrated sigh. He rolled his eyes at my parents, performing his annoyance for their benefit, playing the role of the exhausted older brother dealing with a difficult sibling. He snatched the top folder from the stack. He flipped it open and stared at the bold, capitalized letters printed across the cover page. "Notice of default and foreclosure," Spencer read aloud. For a moment, the words hung in the air, completely disconnected from the reality he had constructed in his mind. Then he burst into laughter. It was a loud, genuine laugh of pure amusement. He tossed the folder back onto the desk and shook his head, looking at me with an expression of absolute pity. "Is this a joke?" Spencer asked, chuckling as he looked over at Richard. "Are you seriously trying to play a prank right now? What kind of fake amateur document is this? Did you actually pay these guys in the cheap suits to print out a phony foreclosure notice just to try and scare me? This is pathetic, Olivia. Even for you, this is a new low. Is this your idea of a counteroffer? You print out some scary-sounding legal words and think I'm going to back down." Richard let out a booming laugh from his chair, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Good Lord, Olivia," he muttered, taking a sip of his scotch. "I knew you were emotional, but I did not realize you were completely detached from reality. You cannot just type up a fake foreclosure notice because you are angry about paying a settlement. That is not how the adult world works. Now stop embarrassing yourself. Put away these little prop documents and write the check before we lose our patience and reinstate the intellectual property lawsuit." I did not say a word. I simply stepped back, allowing my lead attorney to take the floor. He stepped directly up to the edge of the mahogany desk, looking down at Spencer with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon about to perform an amputation. My client did not type up a fake document. Mr. Bennett, the attorney, stated, his voice resonating with absolute legal authority. "That is a certified, legally binding notice of default and foreclosure. It was officially filed with the county clerk at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, effectively locking down every single commercial asset attached to your limited liability companies." Spencer stopped laughing. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, creeping confusion. He looked at the attorney, then down at the red-stamped folder, and then back up at me. "What are you talking about?" Spencer demanded, his voice suddenly sharp and defensive. "You cannot foreclose on me. You are not a bank. You have absolutely nothing to do with my commercial real estate portfolio." The attorney adjusted his jacket, his expression hardening into stone. "That is where you are completely mistaken, Mr. Bennett. As of yesterday afternoon, my client acquired the entirety of your outstanding commercial debt portfolio through her holding company, Obsidian Capital Management. She purchased your promissory notes, your deeds of trust, and the personal guarantees attached to them. You are no longer dealing with your previous commercial lenders. You are dealing with us." The color began to drain from Spencer's face as the gravity of the attorney's words slowly began to penetrate his massive ego. He stared at the red ink stamped across the folder, the letters suddenly looking much sharper, much more real. The attorney leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk, bringing his face inches from Spencer. "Let me be absolutely clear about the dynamic in this room," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The woman standing behind me is no longer your sister today. She is the sole managing director of Obsidian Capital Management. And as of this exact moment, she is your sole senior creditor. You owe her everything, and she has come to collect." Spencer stared at the attorney, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. He looked at the thick stack of folders, then up at me, his eyes searching for any sign that this was a bluff. There was none. He shook his head, a nervous, forced chuckle escaping his throat. "That is impossible," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "You cannot just buy someone's commercial debt without their direct permission. That is not how banks operate. They would have called me. They would have absolutely notified me if they were transferring my accounts." I stepped forward, moving my attorney aside so I could look directly into my brother's terrified eyes. "They do not have to notify you, Spencer," I explained, keeping my tone educational, as if I were speaking to a slow child. "Welcome to the reality of the United States financial system. When you take out commercial loans and you fail to make your payments for 3 consecutive quarters, your debt becomes classified as a distressed asset. Banks despise carrying toxic assets on their balance sheets. It severely hurts their credit ratings and greatly angers their shareholders. They want to offload those bad loans as quickly as humanly possible to mitigate losses. And they have the absolute legal right to package your promissory notes and sell them to any private equity firm or holding company willing to take on the financial risk." Spencer gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning stark white. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. "But you are just a software developer," he stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "You do not run a private equity firm." "I do as of yesterday," I corrected him. "When Apex Holdings acquired my company for $170 million, I did not just take a cash deposit and sit on my hands. I instructed my wealth management team to allocate $30 million of my personal payout to establish Obsidian Capital Management. We approached your desperate commercial lenders and made them an all-cash offer to purchase your entire portfolio of defaulted debt. They were absolutely thrilled to wash their hands of your catastrophic mismanagement. They sold me every single one of your loans at a steep discount. I now possess the deeds of trust, the commercial mortgages, and all the legal leverage that your previous banks held over your head." Richard shot up from his leather club chair, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "This is illegal," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You cannot maliciously target your own family like this. We will immediately sue you for predatory financial practices. We will have this entire transaction reversed by a federal judge today." My lead attorney turned his icy gaze toward my father. "The transaction is fully compliant with all state and federal banking regulations, Mr. Bennett," he stated flatly. "Commercial debt acquisition is a standard practice on Wall Street. There is nothing predatory about a creditor purchasing legally binding contracts. What is highly irregular, however, is your son's complete and utter failure to service those debts." I turned my attention back to Spencer, who had sunk down into his executive chair, his arrogant posture completely deflated. "Let us review exactly what Obsidian Capital Management currently owns," I said, tapping the top folder on his desk. "I currently own the direct commercial mortgage on this extremely large and absurdly overpriced office space. I own the financing contracts on the 3 strip malls you have been pretending are profitable. I own the liens on your imported sports cars. Every tangible asset tied to your limited liability companies is now officially my property. You missed your grace period, Spencer. You defaulted on your obligations. The notices in front of you are the formal declaration that I am seizing all of it to satisfy the outstanding balances." Patricia stood up from the expensive velvet sofa, her manicured hands shaking violently. She looked at Spencer with sheer panic in her eyes. "Spencer, tell her she cannot do this." Patricia pleaded, her voice shrill and desperate. Tell her she cannot just take your business away. Spencer could not look at his mother. He kept his eyes glued to the polished mahogany desk, his entire world crumbling into dust. He knew exactly what was coming next. He knew the fatal flaw in his financial structure, and he knew I had found it. I turned to face my parents, my expression remaining completely impassive. Spencer cannot tell you anything, Mom, I said calmly. Because Spencer does not have any power in this room, and more importantly, neither do you. Richard took a step toward me, his hands balled into tight fists. What are you talking about? He demanded loudly. You must leave us out of this right now. This is between you and your brother. It absolutely stopped being just between me and Spencer the first day you recklessly decided to endlessly fund his pathetic vanity projects, I replied. When you purchase a commercial debt portfolio, you also acquire all the attached collateral and guarantees. My team reviewed Spencer's original loan originations. No commercial bank was going to lend millions of dollars to a man with zero successful track record unless someone with actual assets co-signed the notes. I watched the realization hit my father. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a sudden paralyzing horror. You signed personal guarantees for him, Dad? I stated, letting the words echo in the silent office. You and Mom put your own names on his corporate loans to secure his credit lines. You used your primary residence as collateral. Therefore, by acquiring Spencer's defaulted debt, I also acquired the liens on your personal estate. I do not just own Spencer's failing business and his expensive cars. I permanently own the mortgage to your massive, sprawling Connecticut mansion. I now permanently and legally own the very roof over your heads. The realization hit them like a freight train. Patricia sank onto the velvet sofa, her legs giving out. She clutched her chest, breathing shallowly. Richard looked as though he had aged 20 years. His jaw worked silently, trying to formulate a defense for a scenario he never anticipated. But it was Spencer who finally broke the silence. The blood rushed to his face, turning his complexion a deep purple. He stood up so fast his chair slammed into the wall behind him. You cannot do this! Spencer screamed, his voice cracking with panic. It is completely illegal. You cannot steal our parents' house. That is a fraudulent acquisition. I will call the FBI. This is an insider trading conspiracy, Olivia. You are going to federal prison for this. He slammed his hands onto his desk, leaning over the scattered foreclosure documents, his eyes bulging with rage. I did not even flinch. I let him scream until his lungs burned. My lead attorney confidently stepped forward. There is no fraud here, Mr. Bennett, the attorney stated. His voice maintained the calm cadence of a professional explaining a concept to a toddler. What my client executed is standard Wall Street practice. It happens thousands of times daily. You borrowed millions you could not afford and failed to pay it back. The attorney tapped the folder resting on the desk. You missed your last 3 quarterly payments, Spencer. In commercial finance, that is a catastrophic default. Your lenders were entitled to seize your assets months ago, but they deemed the legal fees too expensive for the meager return your failing properties would provide. They sold the debt to us, and we are exercising the contractual right to foreclose immediately. The grace period expired 90 days ago. You have no recourse, no appeal process, and no way out. Patricia let out a loud wail from the sofa. Richard, do something, she cried, her country club persona shattered. She is taking the house. She is taking everything. Call your lawyers. Richard finally found his voice, though it lacked any authority. Olivia, please, he pleaded. This has gone far enough. You made your point. You proved you are smarter than us. We apologize. Just tear up those papers and we can go back to being a family. We will figure out a payment plan. I looked at my father, feeling disgust. You do not get to ask for a payment plan after trying to extort me? I replied, my tone colder than the winter air. You do not get to forge my signature, steal my college fund, threaten to ruin my corporate acquisition, and then beg for mercy when I flip the board. I am officially foreclosing on all of Spencer's properties and your estate. You will receive the formal eviction notices by the end of the day." Spencer stared at me, his chest heaving. His mind was fracturing. For his entire life he had been the golden boy. He had been shielded from consequence, handed millions, and told he was a genius. He built his entire identity on the delusion of his own superiority, using me as the baseline for his comparisons. Now the sister he mercilessly bullied was standing in his office, legally stripping him of his wealth. The cognitive dissonance was too much for his fragile ego to process. He snapped. With a primal roar, Spencer launched himself forward. He scrambled over the top of the mahogany desk, sending the foreclosure documents, his crystal glass, and the pen holder crashing to the floor. He lunged directly at me, his hands outstretched, his face contorted in an ugly mask of pure violent desperation. He wanted to tear the victory away from me. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. Before Spencer could clear the edge of the desk, the three men moved with terrifying speed. They were not just corporate attorneys. They were trained executive security contractors dressed in suits hired by Apex Holdings to protect their assets. The lead contractor stepped in front of me, intercepting Spencer. He grabbed my brother by the lapels of his suit, used Spencer's own forward momentum against him, and violently slammed him down onto the floor. The impact shook the office windows. Spencer gasped for air as the oxygen was forcefully expelled from his lungs. In a matter of seconds, the two other security contractors descended upon him rapidly. One pinned his legs, while the lead contractor wrenched Spencer's arms behind his back, pressing a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades. "Get off me!" Spencer wheezed, his face mashed into the rug. "Let me go! I will kill her! I swear to God I will kill her!" The security contractor applied more pressure to his spine, easily subduing his struggles. "Mr. Bennett, I highly suggest you stop resisting before I am forced to break your arms," the contractor warned. I stepped around the overturned desk and walked over to where my brother lay pinned to the floor. I looked down at his humiliated form. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he looked entirely pathetic. Patricia was screaming from the sofa, while Richard stood frozen in terror. "You always thought you were untouchable, Spencer," I said. "You thought the rules did not apply to you because Mom and Dad always bought your way out of trouble. But they cannot buy your way out of this. You crossed the wrong woman. Welcome to the real world." My security team held him there, neutralizing the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. I felt absolute, undeniable control over my own destiny. The Bennett family legacy, built on arrogance, theft, and misogyny, was officially terminated. I turned my gaze toward the heavy oak doors of the executive office. The timing was flawless. I knew exactly who was waiting on the other side. Spencer had lost his company, his money, and his parents' home. Now he was about to lose the very last piece of his life. The heavy oak doors of the executive office swung open with a resounding thud that echoed through the tense room. Every eye snapped toward the entrance. Spencer ceased his frantic struggling under the weight of the security contractor. Richard and Patricia gasped in perfect unison. Walking through the doorway was Naomi. She did not look like the quiet, supportive wife they were accustomed to ignoring at family dinners. She looked like an absolute force of nature. She was dressed impeccably in her charcoal gray court attire, her hair pulled back into a severe, flawless style. Her posture was rigidly straight, radiating an aura of total, uncompromising authority. She did not arrive alone. Flanking her on her right was a tall, stoic man holding a thick manila envelope, clearly a licensed process server. Flanking her on her left were 2 fully uniformed city police officers, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. The sheer visual impact of her arrival completely paralyzed the room. Patricia, still trembling on the velvet sofa, let out a confused, high-pitched whimper. "Naomi, what is going on?" Patricia cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. "Why did you bring the police into Spencer's office? Tell them to help him. Tell them Olivia's thugs are attacking your husband." Naomi did not even glance at my mother. She ignored Patricia entirely, treating her like an insignificant ghost in the room. She ignored my father, who was standing frozen by his leather club chair, with his mouth hanging slightly open. She locked eyes with me for a brief, silent second. It was a look of mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement between two women who had successfully executed a flawless, synchronized strike against the men who had vastly underestimated them. Then Naomi slowly lowered her gaze to the floor. Spencer was still pinned against the expensive wool rug, his cheek mashed into the fibers. He looked up at his wife, his eyes wide with a mixture of desperate hope and utter terror. "Naomi," he rasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Thank God you are here. Olivia has gone completely insane. She forged documents to steal the company. Tell these cops to arrest her." Naomi walked slowly across the room. Her heels clicked with the same steady, lethal rhythm as mine had just moments before. She stopped right at the edge of the overturned mahogany desk, looking down at the man she had promised to spend her life with. There was no love in her dark eyes. There was no pity whatsoever. There was only the cold, clinical detachment of a prosecutor examining a guilty defendant. "I am not here to save you, Spencer," Naomi said. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "I am here to eradicate you from my life." Naomi reached out and took the thick manila envelope from the process server standing directly beside her. She did not hand it to Spencer. She simply let it go. The heavy envelope fell through the air and landed with a loud, satisfying smack right next to his face on the rug. "Consider yourself officially served the process server," announced, clearly fulfilling his strict legal obligation before stepping back into the hallway. Spencer stared cross-eyed at the envelope resting inches from his nose. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Naomi crossed her arms over her chest. "That is your new reality," she stated coldly. "Let us go through the contents, shall we? The first document is a petition for the immediate dissolution of our marriage. I am filing for divorce, Spencer. I am claiming total dissipation of marital assets due to your gross financial negligence and illegal activities. You are getting absolutely nothing from me. Not my savings, not my retirement, and certainly not the future earnings you plan to leech off of." Spencer squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic whine escaping his throat. "Naomi, please, we can talk about this. I just made a few bad investments. I was going to fix it." "You did not make bad investments," Naomi corrected him, her voice slicing through his pathetic lies like a surgical scalpel. "You committed felony fraud." Which brings us to the second document in that envelope. It is a formal notice of a massive civil lawsuit. I am suing you for the fraudulent secondary mortgage you took out on my Boston brownstone. I found the paperwork, Spencer. I saw the fake notary stamp. I know you forged my signature to steal the equity out of my premarital home to funnel cash into your bankrupt shell companies. Richard let out a loud, horrified gasp. He stumbled backward, collapsing heavily into his leather club chair. He looked at his son, the golden child he had practically worshipped his entire life, with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. "You forged a mortgage on your own wife's house?" Richard breathed, the final illusion of his son's brilliance shattering into a million pieces. Naomi kept her focus on Spencer. "And it was not just the shell companies, was it?" she continued. "I also found the wire transfers to Miami. I hope Amber, the fitness instructor, was worth destroying your entire life for." Patricia let out a piercing scream. Spencer began to sob loudly, his arrogance finally completely erased. "The third document is a temporary restraining order," Naomi replied, watching him cry. "It legally bars you from coming near me and completely freezes our joint accounts." The taller police officer suddenly spoke up, stepping forward. "Mr. Bennett, we are not here for the civil matters. We are here because your wife filed a formal criminal complaint regarding the forged notary stamp. We are here to ask you to stand up and place your hands behind your back." Naomi silently looked down at him for one last time. She slowly turned on her heel, her tailored suit immaculate, and walked out of the corporate office without ever looking back at him. The taller police officer reached down firmly, grasping Spencer by the arm, and hauled him forcefully to his feet. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence of the executive office. Spencer did not fight them anymore. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He looked like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had stood in this very room just 20 minutes ago, lecturing me about the absolute necessity of male financial stewardship. As the officers read him his rights and led him toward the door, he did not look back at our parents. He did not look at me. He just stared blankly at the floor, the reality of his imminent federal incarceration finally crushing the last remaining fragments of his ego. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, leaving the three of us standing together in the wreckage. Patricia stood frozen beside the velvet sofa, her manicured hands clamped tightly over her mouth. The diamond necklace resting around her throat suddenly seemed to mock the absolute devastation of her current reality. She had just watched her golden child, the perfect son she had sacrificed all her morals to protect, get escorted out in handcuffs like a common criminal. She knew with absolute certainty that there was no secret trust fund left to bail him out. There were no elite country club connections powerful enough to make federal fraud charges simply disappear. The grand illusion of the Bennett family perfection was completely shattered. The silence stretched until it became physically unbearable. Then Patricia finally broke. She let out a long, agonizing wail, the sound tearing violently through her throat. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the wool rug, her tailored tweed suit bunching up awkwardly around her legs. She did not care about her pristine appearance anymore. She did not care about maintaining her dignified posture. She began to sob hysterically, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Richard remained glued to his leather club chair, his head buried deep in his hands, paralyzed by his own cowardice. He offered her no comfort. He had no solutions left to offer. Patricia dragged herself across the floor, crawling desperately toward where I stood, flanked by my security team. She looked up at me. Her makeup ruined her eyes, bloodshot and terrified. "Olivia, please," she begged, her voice raw and gravelly. "You have to stop this immediately. You have to tell your lawyers to fix this mess. We are your family. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot just take our house away from us. Where will we go? All of our friends are in Connecticut. Our entire life is inside that house. You cannot do this to your own parents." I looked down at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel invisible. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the slightest urge to reach down and help her up from the floor. I just watched her unravel, feeling detached from her suffering. When I did not respond, Patricia reached for the ultimate manipulation card. It was the weapon toxic mothers always kept hidden in their back pockets, ready to deploy whenever they lost control of their victims. "I gave birth to you," Patricia screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I carried you for 9 months. I fed you. I clothed you. I gave you life, Olivia. You owe me for your very existence. You cannot leave your own mother homeless on the street. It is unnatural. God will punish you for turning your back on the woman who brought you into this world." I stared at her, the ice in my veins freezing any remaining emotional connection I had left to this toxic family. "You gave birth to me," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of any warmth. "That is a biological fact. But let us be very clear about what happened after that moment. You gave birth to me, but I paid my own hospital bills when I was sick. I paid my own college tuition by working double shifts until my feet literally bled. I built my own successful life from scratch while you actively tried to tear it down. You did not clothe me with love." I continued, stepping slightly closer so she could hear every single syllable. "You clothed me with constant criticism. You did not feed my ambitions. You intentionally starved them. Every single time I achieved something, you diminished it just to make your precious son look taller. You used me as a convenient prop to make yourself look like a generous mother to your country club friends while treating me like an unwanted burden behind closed doors. You demand absolute loyalty based on a biological transaction that happened over 3 decades ago, but you have never once acted like an actual mother to me. Patricia whimpered loudly, trying to reach out and grab the hem of my coat, but my lead security contractor immediately stepped between us, forcing her to pull her hand back. You sold your right to call yourself my mother. The day you decided to forge my signature, I told her, making sure the truth landed with maximum impact. You traded your maternal title for $500,000 to save a massive failure. You chose your son over me just like you have done every single day of my life. And now you are going to live with the severe consequences of that choice. I turned my attention to Richard, who finally looked up from his shaking hands. His eyes were red and watery. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your belongings and vacate my properties, I declared, projecting my voice so it echoed clearly across the room. Both the Connecticut mansion and this office space. If you are not gone by 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, I will have the local sheriff physically remove you for trespassing. Do not try to take the expensive appliances. Do not try to strip the copper wiring. I have already dispatched a professional inventory team to document the condition of both estates. I did not wait for their response. There was nothing left to say. The debt was settled. The toxic cycle was permanently broken. I turned around and walked toward the heavy oak doors, my legal and security teams following closely behind. Behind me, Patricia's hysterical sobbing echoed loudly, mixing with Richard's pathetic apologies. But I did not stop. I walked out of the executive suite, leaving them alone in the absolute ruins of their own making. I walked out of the executive suite, leaving them alone in the absolute ruins of their own making. The elevator ride down was incredibly peaceful. When I stepped onto the Manhattan pavement, I took a deep breath of winter air. It tasted like absolute freedom. Fast forward exactly 3 months. The perfect illusion of the Bennett family empire had not just crumbled, it had been incinerated and the ashes scattered to the wind. Spencer's downfall was swift, brutal, and highly publicized. He lost his commercial real estate company within the first 30 days. My wealth management team, Obsidian Capital Management, legally seized every single property, liquidated the remaining viable assets, and permanently dissolved his companies. But the financial ruin was merely the prelude to his actual punishment. Naomi kept her promise. She handed the forged secondary mortgage documents, the fake notary stamps, and the offshore wire transfers directly to the federal prosecutor's office. Because Spencer's accounts were entirely frozen, he could not afford the high-powered criminal defense attorneys he desperately needed. He was assigned a notoriously overworked public defender. Amber, the Miami fitness instructor, abandoned him the exact second his credit cards started declining. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting a highly publicized trial for multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. His arrogant smirk had been permanently erased, replaced by the terrifying realization that he was facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. My parents, Richard and Patricia, experienced a different kind of imprisonment, the kind built entirely out of profound social humiliation. When my legal team executed the foreclosure on their Connecticut mansion, they assumed their wealthy friends would rush to their rescue. They were violently mistaken. The country club elite do not tolerate financial failure, especially when it is plastered across the local business journals. Richard and Patricia were quietly but firmly asked to resign their memberships to avoid bringing further scandal to the club's prestigious reputation. The people they had spent decades trying to impress completely turned their backs on them overnight. Without the massive equity of their home and with their retirement accounts entirely drained to satisfy the personal guarantees they had foolishly signed for Spencer, they were left with absolutely nothing but their monthly Social Security checks. They were forced to move into a cheap, cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the undesirable side of town. I was told by the asset liquidators that Patricia spends her days sitting on a faded linoleum floor crying over the loss of her imported Italian tiles, while Richard stares blankly at the peeling wallpaper, a broken patriarch who finally realized that his toxic pride had cost him his entire kingdom. I did not feel sorry for them. I felt a profound sense of justice. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I drove back to the sprawling stone mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The property was now legally registered under my name. The driveway was empty. The massive oak front doors were unlocked. I walked through the cavernous foyer and stepped into the grand dining room, the exact place where Spencer had thrown that $5,000 envelope at my face on Christmas Eve. The crystal chandelier still hung from the ceiling, but the room was entirely stripped of its expensive furniture. It was just an empty hollow shell. My lead construction contractor walked in behind me carrying a heavy steel sledgehammer. He stopped beside me and handed the heavy tool over. I gripped the rubber handle with both hands, feeling the solid weight of the iron head. I looked at the pale blue wall, the exact color Patricia had forced upon me when I was a child. I raised the sledgehammer over my shoulder, engaged my core, and swung it forward with every ounce of strength I possessed. The steel head smashed through the drywall with a thunderous explosive crack. Plaster dust exploded into the air, raining down onto the hardwood floors. I pulled the hammer back and swung again, tearing a massive jagged hole through the very foundation of my childhood prison. I was not going to sell the mansion. I was going to completely demolish it. In its place, I had already finalized the architectural blueprints to construct a state-of-the-art, fully funded incubator for female tech founders. I was going to take the toxic ground where my family had constantly told me I was worthless, and I was going to build a fortress where brilliant, ambitious women would be given the seed capital, the mentorship, and the absolute support they needed to build their own empires. I was going to turn my pain into a monument of undeniable empowerment. Later that evening, I sat in the plush leather seat of a chartered private jet, waiting on the tarmac at Teterboro Airport. The flight attendant poured a generous glass of vintage champagne and placed it gently on the tray table beside me. I looked out the oval window as the jet engines began to roar to life, preparing for the transatlantic flight to Paris. It was going to be my first actual vacation in over a decade. I picked up my cell phone. The screen was clear. There were no frantic text messages from Gordon Maxwell. There were no threatening emails from my brother. There were no manipulative voicemails from my mother demanding that I fix their broken lives. The silence was absolutely beautiful. I took a slow, luxurious sip of the crisp champagne. Then, with a satisfied smile, I pressed the power button on my phone and swiped the screen to completely shut it off. The screen faded to black. I leaned back into the soft leather, closed my eyes, and finally allowed myself to simply breathe. Has your family ever underestimated your potential? Tell me how you proved them wrong in the comments. The story of Olivia Bennet is not just a tale of corporate revenge or a dramatic family takedown. At its core, it offers a profound reflection on the true nature of power validation and emotional control. The most vital lesson we can extract from Olivia's journey is that true empowerment is achieved the moment you stop waiting for toxic people to acknowledge your worth. For decades, Olivia was positioned as the family scapegoat, constantly belittled while her brother was celebrated. A lesser person might have spent their newfound wealth trying to buy their family's love, or wasted their energy screaming at the dinner table, trying to force an apology. Fortunately, Olivia did neither of those things. She understood that fighting loudly only feeds the ego of the abuser. Instead, she intelligently weaponized her silence and her success. The defining lesson here is about setting ironclad boundaries and recognizing that biological ties do not excuse psychological or financial abuse. Blood does not entitle anyone to cross your boundaries, drain your resources, or disrespect your ambitions. Olivia's ultimate victory was not merely acquiring her brother's debt or foreclosing on her parents' mansion. Her real victory was taking the very space that caused her trauma and literally demolishing it to build a foundation that empowers others. She brilliantly transformed a dark legacy of misogyny and emotional manipulation into a powerful, thriving incubator designed entirely for female ambition and success. This powerful story teaches us that we cannot change how toxic family members view us, but we possess the absolute power to dictate how we respond. When you redirect the energy spent seeking approval into building your own independence, you become untouchable. If you have ever had to cut ties to protect your peace, share your story of breaking free in the comments below.